Welcome, aspirants. Today, we are going to decode a model that's not just a classic, but a true cornerstone of economic planning, especially right here in India. We're talking about the Harrod-Domar growth model. Let's jump right in and get you completely exam ready.
So, you might be asking why this model? Why all the focus? Well, because this wasn't just some abstract theory. This was the intellectual engine that powered India's very first 5-year plans. So understanding it isn't just about passing an exam, it's about grasping a huge piece of our economic history. And yeah, trust me, the examiners absolutely love this topic.
Okay, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll tackle the central puzzle the model tries to solve. Then, we'll look at Harrod's and Domar's unique approaches. After that, we'll see how they both come together. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with a super fast revision to make sure all these key points are locked in your memory.
So let's set the stage. What was the big question that even led to this model? You know, back in the mid-20th century, two brilliant economists, R.F. Harrod and F.Z. Domar, were working totally independently, but they were both wrestling with the exact same problem. How does an economy achieve stable, long-term growth? And they both landed on one key factor: investment.
Now, if there's one thing you take away from this entire session, let it be this. The absolute heart of the model is the dual role of investment. Think about it. On one hand, when you spend money on a new factory, it creates jobs and income for people right now. That's the demand side, the Keynesian view. But at the same time, that very same factory increases our ability to produce more stuff tomorrow. That's the supply side, the classical view. The whole model is really just a search for that perfect balancing act between the two.
All right, let's dive into the first half of this story, which comes from Sir Roy Harrod. Now, to really get his thinking, you have to be crystal clear on 3 different ideas of growth that he came up with. These 3 rates are the absolute keys to his entire argument.
First up, we've got the actual growth rate, which we just call G. This one's pretty simple. It's the real growth we actually see happening, the one you hear about in the news, based on GDP numbers. Harrod said this rate really depends on 2 main things: S, which is how much we as a country save, and C, the capital output ratio. That C just means how much capital, how many rupees of investment, do you need to produce 1 rupee of output.
Next, and you really need to pay attention here, is the warranted growth rate, or GW. You can think of this as the Goldilocks rate. It's not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. It's that perfect rate of growth where all the new investment is fully used, nobody's left with unsold goods, and businesses are happy. It's the sweet spot that keeps the economy in balance. And notice the formula uses CRE. That's the required capital output ratio that entrepreneurs are actually planning for.
And finally, there's the natural growth rate, GN. This is the economy's absolute speed limit. It's the fastest an economy can possibly grow in the long run, because it's limited by things like how fast the population is growing and how quickly technology is improving. You just can't grow faster than your resources and people allow. It's the ultimate ceiling.
Okay, here's a little exam hack for you to remember that core formula. Just think of the phrase, good captain scores. G for growth, C for capital, and S for scores, which stands for savings. A simple trick like that can be a real lifesaver when you're staring at a multiple choice question.
So why is getting that warranted growth rate so incredibly important? Well, Harrod himself told us why. He explained that if the economy just strays a tiny bit from this perfect path, there are powerful forces that push it even further away. And this is what leads to his most famous concept, the knife-edge equilibrium.
And this is where you can really see that knife-edge problem in action. If our actual growth, G, accidentally overshoots that perfect warranted rate, GW, then suddenly demand is way ahead of supply. This triggers a massive inflationary boom. But if G falls even a little bit short of GW, you get the opposite problem. Warehouses full of unsold goods, leading the economy to spiral down into recession. It really is a razor-thin balancing act.
Now, let's switch gears and look at this whole puzzle from F.Z. Domar's point of view. He got to a very similar place as Harrod, but he came at it from a different direction, focusing like a laser on that dual role of investment we talked about right at the start. Domar broke it down into 2 clear, simple effects. First, he said, when you invest, that spending boosts total demand in the economy. That's the good old Keynesian multiplier effect. That's the demand side. But second, that exact same investment adds to the country's capital stock, more machines, more factories, which increases our potential to produce things. That's the supply side.
So Domar's big conclusion was that for the economy to stay on an even keel, the growth in our income has to perfectly match the growth in our ability to produce. His formula basically says that the rate of investment growth has to equal sigma, which is the productivity of capital, times S, the savings rate. And hey, another mnemonic for you. Change in investment is simply dynamic, to help you remember the sigma and the S for savings.
So what does this actually look like with real numbers? Well, the model can give us a very precise answer. Let's say for a given country, the national savings rate is 12%, and capital is 25% productive. Domar's formula tells us that the economy's equilibrium growth rate is exactly 3% per year. Any faster, and you get inflation. Any slower, and you get unemployment. That specific number becomes the target.
Okay, so we have Herod's 3 growth rates on one side and Domar's focus on investments 2 roles on the other. So how do they fit together? Well, you can think of them as 2 different roads that lead to the same destination. But the little differences in how they get there, that's exactly the kind of nuance you want to bring up in a descriptive exam answer.
The most important thing to see is that at the end of the day, their math basically says the same thing. Herod's formula for warranted growth and Domar's formula for the required growth rate, they're just 2 different ways of writing the same fundamental truth. And that truth is, for an economy to stay in balance, it cannot stand still. It has to keep growing, continuously.
But what about the differences? This table right here is gold for a comparison question. It lays out the key distinctions perfectly. For example, Dahmer's big fear in the long run was underinvestment, but Herod was more worried about a labor shortage hitting that natural growth ceiling. This is exactly the kind of detail that will make your answer stand out.
All right, let's bring it all home. Time for a final, high-impact revision. Look, to get the top marks, you can't just explain the model. You have to be able to critique it. Understanding a model's limitations is what separates a good answer from a great one, and examiners love to test this.
Let's be real, no model is perfect, and the Herod-Domar model's biggest weakness comes from its super rigid assumptions. It basically assumes that key things like the savings rate and the capital output ratio never change, which, of course, they do in the real world. And crucially, it assumes you can't just hire more workers instead of buying a machine. This total inflexibility is exactly why the model predicts such a dangerously unstable knife-edge path for the economy.
Okay, everyone, this is your screenshot moment. This slide is the entire model, boiled down to its essence. You've got the central idea, the key words you have to use, the 2 main formulas with their mnemonics, and the core problem the model highlights. This is your ultimate cheat sheet for revision.
And we'll end on a final thought for you to ponder. Despite all its flaws and its rigid assumptions, the model's core message, that savings and investment are the absolute engines of growth, is still at the heart of economics today. So the real question for us now is, what lessons from this old model are still relevant for tackling India's growth challenges in the 21st century? That's something to think about. All the very best for your exams.